How did COVID change your world? And by the way, welcome.
Thank you, Haslinda. I think, COVID has been the single most important event when it comes to digitization of our entire industry. Fashion and textile manufacturing, as you would know, has historically been one of the biggest culprits of, polluting the world, especially as it gets faster and faster. So what has happened in the last few years is that e-commerce has made it such that consumers want everything immediately. Consumers want it fast. It's not 2 seasons or 4 seasons a year, it's 12 seasons or more. And what that's done is that there has been an exponential growth in fast fashion, but on the flip side, 70% of the world's landfills are filled with non-biodegradable fabrics and related materials. One T-shirt takes about 2,700 liters of water to, manufacture. This is, you're talking about a supply chain that has 60% of the workers tend to be women in the garment manufacturing industries in countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam and Indonesia and so on. What COVID did was that as it forced the digitization of the entire supply chain because things were required to be shipped so quickly and all online, it also forced transparency across the entire chain, which has been incredibly valuable in terms of providing data to companies to actually do things correctly and transparently, something that wasn't happening before.
You know, you brought up a lot of issues, including transparency, ESG, labor issues. I mean, we talk about how a digital strategy can help boost profit. How do you then tap that increased profitability to drive ESG goals in the business?
That's a very, very important point and a very important question, Haslinda. As we digitize any archaic industry, the first thing that happens is that middlemen fall away and more efficiencies come in. Now, in the fashion industry, what that means is there is a 5 to 10% improvement in profitability as brands source digitally rather than the way they were doing conventionally before. Now, that additional margin or that additional profitability comes with two things. One is naturally a lot of traceability in terms of where the product came from, because you're not dealing with agents and middlemen anymore. So brands and businesses and even very small businesses can now verify whether there was complete compliance in terms of where the product was made, who made it, and whether all rules and regulations were followed in that process. So that's one. The second thing is just that the additional profitability that is getting unlocked can then be reinvested in making sure that the manufacturing processes are carbon neutral or that better fabrics are used. Now, I'm not saying that right now it's a priority for all businesses, but I think in general, as businesses wake up to the fact that consumers do want something which is more conscious and more sustainable, especially since they're consuming so much of it, it becomes extremely important to know that the cost of ESG is not going to hurt your bottom line as a business, as a small business or as a large business, and that profitability can be the driving force behind the adoption of more sustainable practices, which is, I think, a tremendous idea and different from what we've thought historically, where we've thought that solving for climate change or solving for ESG is great in the long term, but it's expensive in the short term. But that does not have to be the way any longer.
It's great that people are talking about ESG sustainability. The thing is, you have to walk the talk. I mean, what do you do about accountability? How do you ensure that companies use suppliers that treat workers well, that support sustainable supply chains?
So, Haslinda, that's exactly right. What we do, and we work with thousands of SMEs that source with us, as well as larger brands. What we do is we have a matrix of third-party compliance checks, as well as sustainability metrics, as well as compliance packages, country by country, so that every brand knows that they have the right means and the right checkpoints that actually validate whether their manufacturing process, whether the people that are in the factories are exactly who they think they are. Now, that is only possible when companies like us have software actually validating that data inside the factories. That's today in 2021. As we look to the next 18 to 24 months, we actually think that the role of RFID tags in each of the factories, the role of blockchain in validating this data actually takes this even further. Again, like I want to emphasize that none of this comes at a cost to the businesses that are working with us. It's not more expensive to do this any longer because the additional profitability can be invested back in these checks and balances, which we provide and companies like us provide, just ensuring fully that the first step of ESG, which is regulatory compliance, is met. Beyond that, a platform like ours, what we do is that we make an a la carte selection. So, the first step is making sure that all regulatory compliance is met. The second is perhaps on, a brand says, I want to make sure that all my manufacturing processes are carbon neutral. Maybe the third one is that I only want to use sustainable fabrics with the right, checks and balances in place, just to make sure that, landfills are not getting filled up with non-biodegradable materials and so on. We understand that it's not a binary switch. You can't just force businesses today to be completely ESG compliant. So it's baby steps, one by one, that takes us there in the future. But it's already significantly better than, say, it was 5 years ago.
Quantify that for us. How much traction are you seeing? I mean, if you take a look at the fashion industry in Asia in particular, it is one of the biggest culprits. I mean, one of the biggest offenders when it comes to labor issues, for instance. How much traction? I mean, how are you reaching out? How are you convincing those who work with you?
So absolutely, Haslinda. So there are about 5,000 factories in ASEAN and South Asia that engage in manufacturing for what we would broadly call fast fashion. And, what we're discussing now is that fast fashion doesn't have to be all bad. As of today, about 10% of those factories are engaged in supplying to digital channels such as us and, are open to validating their entire processes. Now that's great, because in most industries, the penetration of sustainable or ESG compliance is less than 3%. So it's already great that ASEAN and South Asia are moving the right direction, even when compared to China and other manufacturing hubs in the world. There's a far greater degree of transparency that's already available amongst the let's say the fast fashion manufacturers in this region. The next step for us would be to encourage these businesses that are already using us and other digital platforms to then adopt the use of carbon neutral processes, processes that help and conserve resources like water, and making sure that the products or the fabrics, etc., that are being used are also sustainable. Wherein it's probably, today the industry is at less than 5% penetration. Again, just for the benefit of everybody, 5 to 10% of manufacturers in our industry already using digital or adopting digital methods has only happened because of the pandemic. But it's great because a lot of other sectors are not this far ahead. Of course, fashion has been a big culprit historically, so there's a lot to make up for.
Ankiti, I just want to reveal the results of our poll. The question was, what's the greatest opportunity for e-commerce? We have 16% voting for lowering prices and speeding delivery, 16% bringing visibility to supply chains to force them to become more sustainable, 42% opening new markets for small and medium-sized enterprises, 26% actually e-commerce creates new problems around monopolies and abuse of personal data. So 42% voting for opening new markets for small and medium-sized enterprises. Ankiti, I want to pose this question to you. What's your own choice? What's the greatest opportunity for e-commerce?
I really agree with the audience here. I think the real opportunity is in unlocking potential for SMEs and new businesses, especially as we see that a string of new businesses are online first, or what we call digitally native. And being digitally native makes it such that it's not just the way that they sell to consumers that is digital. It's the way that they source, the way that they manufacture, the way that they finance their business, which is digital, more transparent, and thus much, much more reliable, as well as, I would say, conscious in the way that business is conducted, just because there is so much transparency. So I completely agree with the audience, and I'm sure everybody in our startup does as well, that is perhaps the largest opportunity that we're about to unlock.
Earlier, Ankiti, you talked about how there is a checklist when it comes to ESG, transparency, and so on and so forth. Give us a sense of what standards are being used. Are they in line with global standards, and and will they be tweaked as we move forward?
Absolutely. So, Haslinda, today, what's happening on our platform and on most digital platforms is that every country has the base is making sure that the manufacturing standards are reliable in terms of labor, in terms of who's making the product, and whether all regulatory checks are being performed at the shop floor of a factory where the product is being made. So the standards used by Zilingo and are obviously global standards, but they vary from country to country, because every we're in 8 manufacturing hubs. Every country provides its own regulatory compliance checks. Now that's the bare minimum. That is the requirement. So that's the first point in the checklist that everybody absolutely must comply with. Not just Zilingo factories, but basically anybody in the world making anything must comply with that. And then the next step is, to comply with fabric checks, right? So what kind of fabric is it? Is it tencel? How was it made? Is it biodegradable? Meaning that when the product does go through its entire life cycle, is it going to be polluting or not? And then the third one is to work with, again, international agencies. And we work with about 6 of them that go at the level of, again, might vary from country to supply hub, to actually check on the processes that make the manufacturing be either carbon neutral, or consume the right amount of water, or just recycle the products that would typically go to waste. So I would say these are the 3 steps in the checklist. And I would just encourage every business to think of the regulatory checks as the first point, which absolutely needs to be met.
The thing is, it's a huge problem, and it involves a lot of manufacturers. We have about 170 million child laborers in the textile industry alone. Have you experienced any pushback? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of the feedback from manufacturers and perhaps even governments?
Absolutely. I think, this is, again, fashion, textile, home. These are supply chains that have historically had, a lot of controversy. In fact, we don't do a lot of work in China, but, in fact, the Xinjiang cotton crisis that recently became a huge problem was, again, the same supply chain. We've had fast fashion brands, global large fast fashion brands be criticized at scale because they were not checking, whether there were little children in factories and so on and so forth. So I think historically it's been a big issue. What the pandemic has done by removing agents is that basically the opacity behind which these practices were hiding went away. Now, when that opacity goes away, the agents go away, and the brands and the consumers can see to a much greater degree, or have that traceability to a much greater degree. There is nowhere to hide, and whether it is pushback from local unions in a lot of these countries and so on, it's actually incredibly hard when you digitize the entire chain. So the reason that historically some of these practices existed is only because businesses wanted more profitability. So what we deeply believe is that by freeing up those margins, you're giving people an incentive to do the right thing without it being more expensive, and that's perhaps the most effective way of doing it. The carrot, and not necessarily just the stick in this supply chain.